maybe there's 10, 12 years, I think, since I shared about the last part of my story. Something subtle began to change, and I think for me it began to happen in the Word. As I spent time in the Word, Jesus began to stick out to me. I think always as I'd approached the Word before, I was interested in what it said on how I could live my life for Him. That what it was saying and what the Holy Spirit was saying to me through it on how I could live out my life and my ministry with Jesus. But I think more and more it was the person of Jesus. I can remember some of the stories of, for example, the one on Jesus walking in the water and, the boat and the waves. And I began to long to experience Jesus in that kind of way. I mean, God had interacted and blessed and led my life in huge ways. I mean, He'd rescued my boat from many a storm over the years. He'd made Himself real to me in my heart, but to somehow know Him, to somehow touch Him. The thing that began to change in me was this life with Him is really about Him. I think I had become so distracted by serving Him and working with Him and trying to be like with Him and doing what He would do that I'd somehow begin to ignore Him or I was blind to see Him. I don't know what it was, but I found that as days and weeks came along that I became hungry and thirsty. I'd never really known what that word meant for righteousness, but I realized it was righteousness is Jesus. Righteousness is the Father. Righteousness is that relationship with the Holy Spirit. And so I began to look for Him. Not just signs of Him or information about Him or revelations, but Him. Him. I think something that changed in this time was the worship music. I guess worship in churches had always been important to me, and I'd always enjoyed it. But for me, over the years, I think the message had really been the center part. What I could learn, what I could understand, how I could grow in living out the life as a disciple of Jesus Christ. But in time, there would be, I know you've experienced this one song. This one song, and for no reason, tears would begin to stream down my face, and I both loved and I hurt. I longed and I wanted more. And God began to draw me slowly into a place where I guess I could say I began to fall in love. My relationships began to change a bit. And as I began to hang out, minister to, work with, whatever, I began to look for Jesus in the people that I was with. And amazing things began to happen in terms of I sensed the awareness of His presence, Him speaking to me. I guess the greatest thing that changed for me was prayer time. God began to say to me, put down the book. Put down the book. And, I used to, a chapter a day, and maybe one verse, maybe not at all. Jesus began to, I just sensed His word in my heart. Spend the time with me, Tom. Let me love you, Tom. And so my life became more and more about loving Jesus and this gentle awareness that in my times, particularly of prayer, He was there and He was loving me And the deepest desire of my heart grew more and more to love Him back, not only in my prayer times, but in others. You know, I think I had been so caught up with serving Him that again I had missed His tears for the people around Him. There were important things to do for Him. There were important things to do in ministry and the mission trips that I went on, but somehow I really hadn't noticed that His heart breaks for people who are broken. His heart yearns for the people that are lost. Maybe it wasn't until I began to sense His deep love for me that I realized His passion for the people that He sent me to. And so ministry for me began to shift. While before I think it was largely about him or her or them or this retreat or that person at work, it was still about those things, but it was more about Jesus there. It was more about the Father's tenderness there, and I began to look for ways to enter into it. In my prayer times, as time went on, and I think I began to focus more on the presence of Jesus, I began to sense Him going, shh, shh. I've had so many words. And I realized that this whole time, my prayers had been telling Him what's wrong, tell Him what He isn't doing that He should be doing, what's wrong with the universe, how to fix it in a way so that everybody will know it was God, not coincidence. And because He loved me so much, He responded to that kind of audacious, presumptuous prayer. And now I began to say to me, Tom, just shh. There were times when I would sit and just be still with God, and time would fly. Just times of quiet presence when I didn't have to say anything or think of anything or call to mind a verse or ask for a guidance, but just to be with. I think my biggest struggle during this time was, well, two things. One is distractions. I'm still hugely involved in ministry at my church. And those are important things. They're good things. But there are so many things to do. And when I sit and pray, I think, zing, 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 this comes in, this goes out. And I begin to long for these quiet times, these still spaces in prayer. They only may be seconds or just minutes maybe, but the longing of my heart for what I'd call this sweet space with God, but lots of things going. I think another struggle for me during this time is again with church. I think I want to know more and more about Jesus. And again, in our worship songs, we sing about that, but then in the message or in the Bible study class, we talk about how to serve Him again. And I guess I want desperately somebody to unpack for me, what does it mean to love a God you can't see or touch or hear with your ears? What does it mean? How do I do that? How do I really let Him love me and love Him back? I have a friend I've found that's been mentoring me a bit, and she says, Tom, you just need to spend quiet time with God. He's moved you into a place where you just need to be with Him. And I realized there weren't very many places in my life, from getting up in the morning with 3 young kids, going to work, getting home, spending time with kids, having dinner, helping with homework, church on Sunday, in small groups in the evening, there was very little margin in my life for God. And I began to realize that something had to give and had to change. As it happened with me, I wasn't spending huge hours watching football or whatever, and so it was a matter of giving up good things. But something had to give, because I have to know more about Jesus. Mimi, share a slide. I want to just share an experience that is me this time. And this picture, I shared with you that I, this time in my life when I was pastoring in Salt Lake City, started going to the monastery. And there was one room I liked to go to. It was on the corner, room 17. And this was a picture about this size hanging on the wall. It's an old decoupage. Remember, nobody here remembers that, but you take a picture that laminated, many layers of goop on it and on a piece of wood that makes it look ancient or something, and it hanging on one of these chains on the wall. And this picture just sort of captivated me. I'm not really sure why it captivated me, but I began to notice that I had this attachment to this picture. When I'd get to the monastery, my practice was to go 3 days a month, and I became a monk. I mean, that's what had to happen to me. I had to get off the scene. And because when I was home and in my church, I worked all the time. And so I would get to the monastery, and room 17 was taken. And that picture wasn't in whatever room I got. And so when the person in that room was someplace else, I would sneak into the room and switch the artwork and put that in my room. And I thought, this is really kind of sick. And not only was that sick, I wondered about kind of the morbid nature of the picture. That's Mary Magdalene, and she's holding the dead body of Jesus, and it comes from a large painting, and it's just a clip out of the corner. And what is it about Mary Magdalene holding the dead body of Jesus? And I really questioned myself, and it was some years later that I realized what the Holy Spirit was doing in me in that picture. And it had to do with that John passage in Jesus, "Do you love me?" And the Holy Spirit was saying, "Tom, I want you to love me like that. I want you to love me not for what I can do for you." You see, he couldn't do anything for her then. He couldn't give her anything. He couldn't tell her anything. He couldn't reassure her about anything. But she just loved him. And the Holy Spirit was saying to me, "Tom, that's how I want you to love Jesus. Not for what you can get out of him, but because of for who he is." And so God used that very powerfully in that season of my life.